Welcome. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for today's Lunch and Learn webinar. I'm Chris Cardwell, Program Manager for Deep Roots KC, and I'm excited to be here with you once again for the July installment of our 2023 Lunch and Learn series. Before I talk about today's topic and introduce our presenters, I want to make a few announcements. First of all, we're incredibly grateful to the Missouri Department of Conservation and the Arvin L. Gottlieb Charitable Foundation for their support of this broadcast and Deep Roots KC. Also, very grateful to our guests, Good Oak LLC, for their support of Deep Roots educational programming and the sites that we're going to see and discuss today. We're also so grateful to you for your participation, your support of our programs and our webinars. So this webinar and its resources are recorded, and they're going to be posted to the Deep Roots website following the broadcast here. So watch your email and our website. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll be notified each time we upload a video. During the program, please put your questions in the Q&A tool on Zoom, and we'll use the chat feature to share links, answer that question, whether you grow native plants and food, whether you grow native plants as food. This is really the essence of what our topic is going to cover today. And we'll use that chat feature to share links and other information that our speakers are discussing. And so today, I'd like to introduce our topic as an agriculture of nature. Regeneration and balance, or balance and regeneration in human food systems and native plant ecosystems. And our speakers today are Dan Krull and Jacob Canyon, co-founders and ag consultants from Good Oak LLC. And as we begin today's conversation, it's going to be critically important to address this subject matter as it fits into the broader narrative of native landscape conservation and advocacy, right? So written into our histories of our prairie landscapes are these anecdotes of the first Europeans to set foot in this biome, right? These Spanish explorers who wrote of oceans of grass as far as the eye could see. Vegetation that was so lush and so tall that their horses became hidden, and bearded men in armor just appeared to float across the horizon gracefully. And some of these histories also tell about the Europeans who follow many years later, these homesteaders who put plow to prairie, and in a couple backbreaking seasons of toil and tillage, forever undid tens of thousands of years of biological connection and soil development. A little less romantic, right? But in doing so, they tamed the landscape, feeding their families and then the nation. Heroic, right? But now we all should know that there's much, much more to these stories, so much more. And my absolute favorite thing about history is that it's just that. It's history. It's in the past. So today's prairie explorers are an entirely different breed altogether. They are passionate protectors of remnant landscapes, and they're reconstructors of new ones styled after those remnants, with both the macro and the micro perspectives to see what great fortitude is required to preserve and improve our environments at large scale, while zeroing in all the way down into the tiniest relationships that those conservation efforts are incubating. And our guests today are both contemporary prairie explorers and agricultural pioneers, dedicated folks who are developing systems that feed both people and nature, as if those two things were or have somehow become distinct in our modern identities. So with what's sure to be a very robust conversation, let's welcome Jacob Canyon and Dan Krull, co-founders of Good Oak LLC.
Wow, that was a great intro. It's a lot to live up to.
Thank you, Chris. That's wonderful.
I feel like maybe you should just do our presentation for us. That's so eloquent. So we are still waiting for our lunch to arrive, though. If there was a lunch and learn, are we not? You're not going to feed us? Okay.
It's BYOL.
Wow. Oh,
Got
sorry.
it.
We didn't understand that.
Catfished a little bit, but okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Chris, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks everyone. Looks like we've got a good crowd today. It says 80 attendees.
If it gets up over 100, Jacob will take his shirt off. So
yeah,
send it to your friends.
So I'm Jacob Canyon. And this is
Dan Krull.
Who's
Yeah,
that?
Dan Krull. Co-founders. We have a really great presentation for you. We really wish we could hear all of your laughter, though, you know, because like telling all these great jokes is just not going to be as good without that response. So I think that what we realized is that we should just go through our presentation quickly and kind of get it out there, and then answering questions is really where a lot of the magic is going to happen. So we prepared some really cool slides to kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about, and then we just want to encourage you to ask us questions and have a discussion that way afterwards. So
yeah, so we are the co-founders of Good Oak. We're going to talk a little bit about what we do and hope that you guys have interesting responses to that. But before we do that, we just want to kind of set up the philosophy or the principles that help us make sense of the work that we do. So we like these side-by-sides. So here is an image. If you look at this green area and you split it down the middle where that road is, I believe that's Moonlight Road. This is in Western Olathe. So the right half of that screen is the Prairie Center. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It's a lovely place. You should go there. It's 295-acre remnant prairie savanna complex, super diverse. There's all kinds of interesting, beautiful native plants there. I think there's a population of Mead's milkweed out there that the Botanical Garden, Missouri Botanical Garden came out and did some studies on. When I worked for Kansas City Wildlands doing seed collection, it was one of my favorite spots, mostly just because of its scale. There aren't that many remnants in the metro that are that big. There are none that are that big, right? Some fun photos of it. You can see in that bottom right corner, this was a fun project. The extension master naturalists there were doing insect surveys. So beautiful place that's like everything you would want from a piece of land in this part of the country, right? Diverse mix of grassland with, you know, hardwood trees. And then on the other side of that street in the middle, you've got a variety of things, but a lot of tilled ground in this corn and soy rotation that's really glyphosate intensive, using a lot of herbicide, and has very little biodiversity. You know, this is a stock photo, but this is more or less, you guys have driven out in Western Johnson County, and you see a lot of this kind of stubble. Did you want to talk about like the consequences of like this kind of farming?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, one thing that's really important to remember when Chris was referencing the you know, first settlers, European settlers plowing that field, they found that their crops grew extremely well. And the reason why was because there was 18, 20 inches of black topsoil that had been built by, you know, thousands of years of ecosystem engagement in that area. And what we have done in the intervening hundreds of years is mine that into to the point where it's almost gone. And so the way that occurs obviously is through tillage, which destroys all of the things that actually build and maintain the soil, and then the soil then erodes away. So each year when we till the soil, we erode it away, and we're driving North America to the brink of desertification. And some people believe that we have about 60 years of topsoil left before we'll be left with nothing. Now, it's really important to remember that that soil was built through natural processes, and that prairie that's right next door built that soil, right? So our question is, how do we grow food for people while at the same time utilizing those natural systems that build soil instead of destroy it?
Yeah, and we take that as sort of the organizing principle of the work we do. How do we include and support the natural ecology, both because it's a moral good, right? But also because it's actually the means of production that allows us to exist. But do that in a way that allows us to make a living, and that makes food for people, and that can support our civilization. So this is a quote from Gary Snyder that I'm always bringing up. It's just a more complicated way of saying what Dan just said, but I'm still attached to this quote, so I'm going to read it really quick. So Thoreau says, "Give me a wilderness no civilization can endure." That's clearly not difficult to find. What's harder to imagine is a civilization that wilderness can endure. Yet this is exactly what we must try to do. And in fact, in this passage, he goes on to say, and we must do it here in the New World. So we're going to do another side-by-side here. So this is in Viola, Wisconsin. And on the left-hand side, you see more tilled ground. It's in these kind of funny shapes because it's hilly there, and the rows follow NRCS berms, but it's corn and soy, and it's very glyphosate intensive. You have this J-shaped parcel on the right, which is something different. So on the left, you've got the corn and soy. It's producing food, but it's destroying the ecology. On the left, we've got this parcel that we'll talk more about in detail, but it is providing habitat. It's really diverse. It's got a lot of wildlife that participate in it, and it produces food for people.
So it's important, a lot of times when we talk about this, we're talking about farming. And so today we're talking about conservation as well, right? And I would say that the way that we're growing food for ourselves is just untenable. We can't do it anymore. We're going to either run out of soil or we're going to find a new way to do it. But I would say also the way that we conduct conservation doesn't work either. Okay. So right. I love the Prairie Center. We can't just draw little circles around 200 acres and say, "Oop, we conserved it," and that's it. Like we need more, we need more habitat. We need more diverse systems. If we're actually going to succeed in saving the species that are just barely holding on right now. And it's cool to have places like that, and they are templates for us. But what we need to do is figure out how to effectively and quickly spread those types of habitats back out where they belong.
Yeah.
And I think what we're getting at here is that instead of thinking of farming as one thing and conservation as another thing, if we put those two together in an effective way, we can actually accomplish both goals while increasing the quality of life for people, the quality of the food for people, the quality of life of animals, and the quality of life of all the wild creatures that depend on these ecosystems, including ourselves. So anyway.
Yeah, and there might be good reasons to have a space like a remnant that you don't mess with, but it doesn't do much good if the overwhelming majority of the landscape is tilled to dust.
Right.
So we need, as Dan said, we just need a more comprehensive, holistic approach that includes the ecosystem. And I think we have an example of this in this project in Wisconsin. So this is New Forest Farm, which was developed by Mark Shepard over the last 25 or 30 years. Do you want to talk about what we're looking at here?
So what Mark has done is he's used a system called keyline design. He's gone in and identified the way the water moves over his land. And what he's trying to do is to more effectively spread that water out and soak it in so it doesn't just wash away with all the soil. And so the reason you see these lines that kind of go in strange directions, those are actually on contour, and they're trying to spread the water more effectively across the land. And then what he's done is he's taken these contour lines and he's planted trees that produce food for people. Now, Mark selected specifically chestnuts and hazelnuts because they're native to his area and they produce food for humans. But the tree selection that you use on those contours could be almost anything. The upshot is that he has ended up with this savanna mimic where you have large trees that live for hundreds of years, produce food for people. They don't need to be replanted. They don't need to be sprayed. They just drop carbohydrates and fats on us every year. And the space in between is filled with things that you can eat, like berries and mushrooms. And in this case, like in the lanes in between, he's growing asparagus, but in some of it, it's pasture where you can graze cattle and sheep. They're using the wood for firewood. They're growing mushrooms. These two goofballs down here are eating blueberries that we're just growing. I mean, we spent an hour picking blueberries and filled a giant colander full of them. We're roasting locally grown meats and mushrooms that we picked in the forest. It's like the perfect human habitat, basically. It's a savanna filled with food everywhere you look. And everywhere you look, there's native bees, there's butterflies, there's snakes, there's birds, there's deer, everything can use this habitat while it still produces food for people. So what we've been trying to do is figure out a way to quickly cover tilled ground with habitats like this that make room for everyone and build soil instead of destroying it.
So that's our model. I mean, Mark has written a couple of books, and if you guys are interested in this, I would highly recommend Restoration Agriculture. But that is a big inspiration for us and our company. So we're going to talk about the projects that we do. So part of it is doing this kind of high level design and consulting. I got ahead of myself. What we want to do, as Dan said, is mimic the savanna in a way that is anthropocentric, right? That makes food specifically for people, but also includes the rest of the ecosystem. And so just to like set the stage for what we are trying to do, this is the historical extent of the oak savanna. So this transitional space between the forests of the east and the high plains in the west. This was about 50 million acres until about 300 years ago when people started to cut down the trees and plow. So this is our goal, right? We want to see 50 million acres in the United States converted into a savanna analog, into a regenerative system. So
no big deal.
Yeah, might as well shoot for the stars.
We got this.
So part of that is, we do consulting and farm design. These are a couple of projects we've worked on. So on the right, you see a grazing plan. So we use a high density rotational grazing system with animals to ensure that they have a positive impact on the land by giving enough recovery time. We'll talk more about that later. On the left, you see a design for water management and agroforestry plantings on a property in Paola. The basic idea for our agroforestry system is that we, just like New Forest Farm, focus on plants that are native and make food for people. So obviously it's a farm, so we want to make food. And one reason to focus on natives is because you want ecosystem services. But another reason to focus on natives is because they're easier to work with. They don't need to be sprayed. They don't need to be watered. They don't need to be replanted every year. They've already been tested, and we know that they work in this environment. So that's the core of our farm systems, is food producing natives. In addition to that, we do use non-native food crops. So like we love chestnuts, but the American chestnut is sensitive to the chestnut blight. It's not really practical to use. So we use the Chinese chestnut, apples, pears, things like that do fairly well in this climate, but definitely aren't native. And in addition to both of those, we also include native species that aren't crops necessarily, but help provide those ecosystem services, make a more diverse habitat, both again for the moral good of supporting and participating in our local ecology, but also because of the benefits it has to the rest of the farm system by making a more resilient and diverse habitat. Is there anything you wanted to say about this before
I just think that the bur oak has a great deal of potential. As
yes,
we don't use it as a crop right now, but man, like our farm designs, like what we're hoping to do in our ideal farm is to have a mix of all of these things on here and look at the farm on a 400-year succession, where the apple trees that we're planting are the baby trees, the first level, the weeds really. And in 300 years, there's chinkapins and bur oaks, and there's all this abundance that people can live off of, or the animals can live off of. And that if we walked away from it, it would just go on making food, and a lot of the places where we go and collect fruits and seeds, I was in the Osage River Valley last year, and I was standing on the bank fishing, and there's Native American artifacts everywhere. And I look up on the bank and it's like persimmon, pawpaw, spice bush, white oak. Every single tree along the river where this huge population of humans used to live is a food producing tree. That's not by accident. When they got to the rainforest in South America, they were like, man, there's so much fruit and food everywhere. Yeah, it's because it's a food forest. It was designed by people. And when they walked away, it kept on being one, right? So the worst thing we could do, would be to plant all of this and then we all die off and it goes on being this amazing, abundant ecosystem for everything else that comes after us. Then great. That's what I want to spend my life doing. So
Yeah, there's an asterisk after that word crops on the right, on the left-hand side, and that's because, the American Indians made acorn flour out of bur oak acorns. There's, when I was working for Wildlands, I would get questions from volunteers. Is there any native plants out here on the prairie that you can eat? And at first I had a couple answers. Oh, you can make a tea out of this, or they used to boil the milkweed leaves until the latex got out and it makes good greens. And then I got more and more answers as I learned more. And then eventually I realized that the real question is, what can't you eat?
Right.
If you know what you're doing,
it's a much shorter list.
we're omnivores, and if you know what you're doing, there's edible parts of most plants. And the people who were here before colonization made extensive use of a lot of these things. And as Dan said, what we think of as the wild ecosystem was hugely influenced by anthropogenic concerns. So let's get an acorn flour industry built up.
I'm ready.
So in addition to the consultation and design stuff, we also grow trees. So you can see Dan here with an armful of pecans, a favorite of ours. We collect, we do some seed collection ourselves. We buy seeds from vendors as well. There's Dan pulling trees out of a root pruning bed. I think those are the wild plums.
Oh, okay.
It's hard to see with the straw on top.
Yeah.
We also do a lot of beekeeping. So we keep honeybees as livestock. We do it in a way that's very different from industrial beekeeping. So first of all, we don't use bees for pollination services for a couple of reasons. You only need to bring bees out to pollinate a crop if you already killed off all the wild pollinators. So if you don't spray insecticide, you get pollinated for free and you don't have to move the bees around. It's really not good for honeybees to move them around. These photos on the left are from our apiary in Weston, Missouri. We have 100 hives on 180 acres of native woods and prairie restoration. The landowner had already converted a corn and soy field into a prairie restoration. So we line the hives up on the edge. You'll see that they're spaced out quite a bit, and they also look different than the hives you're used to seeing. And I think the most important thing about the way we keep bees that's different is that we capture feral swarms of bees. So we try not to buy packaged bees. So honeybees are obviously not native to North America, but they are naturalized, and they do fine in the wild here, and they're in people's attics and in hollow trees. So we try to take the locally adapted ones that have already been able to hack it and survive the winter. Similar principle, even though they're livestock and they're not a native species, we want to use the ones that are already succeeding and successful here, and not try to put a square peg in a round hole. And then we also keep animals as livestock, ungulates, grazers. We have a flock of about 150 hair sheep on a ranch outside Excelsior Springs, actually on pasture associated with the Van Til Winery. If any of you are familiar with that area. So Dan, do you want to talk about what we're seeing in these images?
Yeah, so this is kind of cool. One thing that we like to remind people of is that there's a lot of different ways to restore land, right? You can go out, this land to the left where you see the sheep is actually covered in bush honeysuckle. And, it's fairly easy to go out and spray that with herbicide to kill it, to get rid of it. But what we've done here is we bring in our sheep flock, cut the bush honeysuckle down, they eat it and turn it into meat and milk. Then we thin out the woodland, turn our hogs loose, and the hogs go in and dig up the roots and, stimulate the soil. And when they move on, the latent seed bank, sometimes seeds that have been sitting under the ground for hundreds of years, will then sprout, and you get a flush of vegetation, which then of course becomes food for the sheep to eat later. But it starts to restore the sort of savanna habitat. So we're using the sheep to actually eat the stuff instead of spraying herbicide on it. We're using the hogs to stimulate the soil. Now, these same two animals could destroy the habitat depending on how we put them on there. Grazing has a really bad reputation because a lot of times we just continuously graze animals in small spaces. They eat all their favorite things until the worst things are left, until the land just looks terrible. But if we graze these animals the way they would graze naturally in the wild, which is constantly moving to new places all the time, giving rest in between, they actually have the ability to stimulate and regenerate habitat. So we're experimenting with different ways to do this in a way that doesn't, involve herbicide, and that actually is profitable because, once they get done eating all the bad stuff, then of course we have the amazing byproduct, which is meat that's derived from animals that got to live their best life. And they're out in the habitat doing the thing they're supposed to be doing. So, oh, great. That's a good next slide.
Yeah, and so there, as Dan said, there's subtlety in how you graze animals, and they can be detrimental if not grazed properly. But we think that there is sorry about that. But we think that it's not just we think. We'll talk more about the research that's been done on this, but the result is this meat that is, I mean, it's frankly better than stuff that you buy at the grocery store that comes from factory farms or that comes from animals that are fed on grain. It's, this kind of lifestyle and this kind of environment makes the animals happier and healthier, and that's reflected in the quality of the meat. If you're going out and volunteering to cut bush honeysuckle, or if you're donating to a local conservation organization, keep doing that. That's really important. But if you're doing that and then you're also buying food that's produced in a way that's actively destroying the environment, that is an opportunity for you to change that and make a big impact by supporting regenerative agriculture that actually can have the impacts you want in terms of habitat restoration and conservation and biodiversity.
That's a really key point too, is that, you may not be able to go out and plant hundreds of acres or millions of acres of savanna mimics like we're talking about doing, but you can support the people who are trying to do it. And there are farmers like us and other people in the area that are already doing this sort of work to create habitat for everyone, for humans and for the wildlife. And the one thing they need is somebody to eat their meat, eat their honey, buy their vegetables, buy their chestnuts. And if you can find those people and support them, you can really change the flow of how things are working right now in the farming industry.
So if you guys are curious about this, in particular with the grazing piece, there's been some really interesting research done on the impacts on organic matter in the soil, the diversity of the soil microbiome, the diversity of insect species, and the diversity of bird species. All are affected, in this case, in a positive way by rotational grazing in a regenerative system. This is a paper, this defining and validating yada yada paper shows some of these effects. I think there were 50 ranches across South Dakota, Nebraska, and Missouri where they show these effects. And in fact, the Audubon Society has a conservation ranching program where they will go to a ranch, work with the landowner to make a habitat management plan, and then certify the beef. Right now, they're only doing beef, but the beef that comes off of that operation as bird friendly.
We've seen this up close, by the way. So as much as you can take me seriously, I will say that their program is legit. We built a habitat management plan for an 800-acre ranch that we're managing over just east of town. And their biologists and their planners really know what they're talking about and really put up the screws to us on our process and how we're going to manage the land. And they're bird specific, but the cool thing to remember is when you manage the land to help the birds, you're going to help the bugs, you're going to help the snakes, you're going to help the mushrooms, you're helping everything, including the people.
So I think that's our spiel, and then I think we should do some questions.
I'm ready.
All right. Well, lots of just really impressive, a lot of impressive practices that you guys are employing, and you're bringing up some pretty curious responses here. But first and foremost, I went ahead and put a link into a goodoak.com/store where I don't know about anybody else, but I got a little bit hungry seeing the kebab and skewer and sausage plate there. And more than one person is asking, where is a direct opportunity to find, say, a list of those people, to where our audience is already definitely dedicated to the conservation causes, to native landscape improvement and expansion. Is there a comprehensive list of those local farmers that can be supported through our food system?
That's a great question, and as I don't know of a comprehensive list, but there should be one. I mean, obviously we're doing it, but I would also mention 5 Mile Farms. They're in Paola, or are they a little south?
They're down in Miami County.
Somewhere in Miami County.
5 Mile down off Lacine Lake. Yep.
Yeah.
That's the
And
prices.
they do goats, and they do chicken, and they do cattle
And hogs.
And then I would also mention Rusted Plowshare. Josh is usually at the Brookside Farmers Market, but I think you can buy from them online, and they focus on lamb and chestnuts.
Oh, and that's a really good answer. A really good way to meet your meat producer is to go to the farmers market and talk to them. Right here in town, we have Herbivore Farm that raises pork, and they also aggregate goods from farms all over the Kansas City region. There's Oddbird Farm. There's what's the one that Green Dirt. I mean, there's tons of them around. But if you go to your farmers market, shake their hand, ask them, hey, do you rotationally graze? Are you a regenerative farmer? Get to know them. That's one of the great things about this system. The meat that you buy at the grocery store, if you went to that farm, they would have signs that say, do not enter, no cameras. There would be like razor wire to keep you out. And if you did get in, you would have to wear like hazmat suits, because the way they raise these animals, it's dangerous for our health, right? But if you go up to someone like us and you say, hey, can I come see your sheep flock? And we'll be like, hey, you want to come help us cut bush honeysuckle? Heck yeah. You want to help us put up some fence? We love having people come out because we want you to see, because it's beautiful and amazing and it makes you feel good. So go to your local farmer's market, shake your farmer's hand, get to know them, develop a relationship, buy veg, buy meat locally. So.
Yeah. Chris, I like that you use the English spelling of plow and plowshare. I think they spell it with a W.
He's from one of those islands out there.
Yeah. I can tell it's in your blood.
Gray also has an A in it, but yeah, I get some grief on that sometimes. Further about that, we've had some of our participants that in the introduction, we said, what are some small scale ag practices that you use? How do you incorporate native and soil health principles? And no-till farming on a 40 by 10 plot of garden is super easy. But is this becoming a best practice trend across the board? Like in these systems, is there also cultivated row crop, and is no-till process part of that?
Can I answer this one?
Go for it.
Oh yeah, buddy. I mean, okay, so the most destructive thing that you can do in any farming system, more destructive even than using herbicides and pesticides, is tillage, okay? And that's in your backyard garden, that's on these big acreages. The tillage destroys the means to production. It kills the basis of the entire soil food web, okay? So it has to go, no matter what we do. Now, to answer your question, remember when we were talking about Mark's farm, New Forest Farms, with the trees on contour, and in between the lanes, he had asparagus growing? Well, in between those lanes, you can grow corn and soy and wheat if you want. You can grow any crop you want, okay? The way that those farms are laid out, they're meant for having lanes of some kind of crop in between. In most of the projects we're designing right now, we're encouraging a diverse native mix of prairie restoration for grazing purposes, because it's quick, right? But if you wanted to go out and grow corn and soy and wheat, you absolutely can do it with no-till. And I'm not going to be able to explain it all to you right here, but we're lucky to have these masters who have been doing it since the 70s that have figured it out. Guys like Dave Brandt, who actually just sadly passed away in a car accident recently, who's been literally doing no-till farming on thousands of acres since before I was born. and has proven that not only is it possible, it's actually more profitable, and the food that comes off the land is more nutritionally dense. And if you ever want to hear somebody talk about that for like 2 hours, just bug me sometime, because I love talking about it. But yes, you can grow grain that way. Now, Mark, Restoration Ag Mark would say we don't need to grow grain. Just plant chestnuts, plant bur oaks, plant hazelnuts. They'll replace all of those carbohydrates. You don't need them. But if you still want to grow them, yeah, you can do it in a way that builds soil and doesn't destroy ecosystems.
Fantastic. Here are a couple quick ones. Janet asks, what do the dead fish do? The pigs are eating dead fish. Where'd they come from?
What's that? A friend of ours works for the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks.
KDWP.
I know it just changed. I'm always getting that wrong.
Oh, KDWP-T.
T.
Park Tourism Park, something like that. Anyway.
A friend of ours works for the state of Kansas, and there's an invasive species of perch, the white perch, that has a huge population in a. Do you remember what lake?
I don't remember where they were fishing, but they're in most of the major reservoirs. They were accidentally introduced, probably by the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks, when they were stocking fish, other fish species that live in places where they're from. So
it was like a volunteer event, an invasive perch removal, but then they had all this fish, and they didn't have enough coolers for everyone to bring it home. So we had her bring it up to one of our farms and feed it to the hogs. So, eat the invaders, right? So we're the lamb is finished on honeysuckle, and the hog is the pork is finished on perch.
Hogs, by the way, they eat just like us. They're omnivores. So they prey on all different kinds of animals, and they eat hundreds or thousands of different species of plants. Their diet, the more diverse their diet is, the more healthy and happy they are. So those fish are a real nice treat for them.
Brilliant. Our friend Sunny is asking about chestnuts. And this is a very specific question. I'm not familiar. What is the Darling 58 line, and how does that fit in regarding chestnuts? Is that maybe a certain selection of chestnuts that are being used in these systems? Or is that?
I'm not familiar with that strain. Like, maybe Sonny could tell us something about it. So
Cool.
One thing that just as a jumping off point that we like to harp on, though, is that it's not always about the line or the strain or the type. It's good to start with certain kinds of genetics, but one of the hallmarks of our regenerative approach is the idea of putting things through natural selection and just letting them go. So Mark calls it stun, sheer total utter neglect. I like to call it systematic total utter neglect. So we want to put trees out in the pasture and just see which ones come up and which ones survive, which ones produce food, and then select from those in our own context. Same thing with our sheep. You'll notice that we run several different breeds of hair sheep. One of those breeds is a Dorper, the other's a Katahdin, there's a St. Croix. We throw them all together, and then we just select whichever ones are producing the best of what we want in our context, and then we eventually create our own herd, right? So not knowing anything about that, I would say, yes, let's use it, let's plant it, and if it does well, we'll keep it, and if it doesn't, cut it down and use it to smoke bacon. So
I just glanced at the link that Sunny shared, and it looks like
share. You're too young to know who that is.
It looks like Share is ageless. It looks like it is a strain of the American chestnut that they crossed to get the resistance.
Sure.
Which is great. That's awesome. Love to use that. We have been planting Chinese chestnuts because we know they're resistant, but that's definitely something to look into.
The whole farm at New Forest Farms is hybrid chestnuts that Mark has either created or purchased. You can't plant Chinese chestnuts in Wisconsin because they're not cold hardy. So his whole farm is in trees infected with the mushrooms that are killing them, right? But some of the trees are thriving, and so what he's trying to do is create a natural strain that's resistant in the same way. There's also work being done where they're using CRISPR to actually make, or is it CRISPR? Maybe it's one of the gene editing programs to actually make a Chinese or an American chestnut that has resistance to, which I've heard about.
Which may be, in fact, this Darling 58.
But one of the interesting things about the chestnut is when the blight started to spread, the first thing people did was to cut them all down. They're like, well, they're going to die anyway, might as well do it now, which is the worst thing you could do from a natural selection standpoint, because any one of those trees that happened to be resistant got killed because it got sawed down and turned into furniture. And actually, Jacob and I were talking about this with the emerald ash borer. We want to add ash trees specifically to our mix of trees that we've planted to help offset this problem, because the only way to fight pests, the only way that works, is natural selection, right? Nature has an answer for it. If you start spraying things, you make the pests stronger and the trees weaker. But if you put a bunch of trees out there and let them fight it out, they'll eventually find something in their genetic card deck that wins the game.
Unreal. What a great thought. And yeah, I am sure that many gardeners are real fond of the sheer total utter neglect practice.
Yeah, if you're a great gardener, you've killed more plants than most people who are not gardeners. So
exactly. Yeah, I'm gonna start telling my neighbors, no, it's natural selection. It's not. I'm just neglecting things. Let's put two questions here together, because we've talked a lot about prairie restoration and how almost as a byproduct you end up with food. And as a byproduct, you end up with an agricultural product. So combining this concept of, okay, cattle versus bison for regenerative agriculture purposes, right? Somebody's asking about whether that's feasible. Ranches all across the nation do that. Speak a little bit to that, but also specifically about prairie restoration as a follow-up for a steward of 77 acres that had cattle on it for generations. Their goal is to restore. Speak a little bit to that process.
Oh, I was gonna.
You'd rather do the bison or you do both. You take the whole thing. I've been talking.
We'll hit it back and forth.
Okay.
Well, firstly on the bison bit, I think in principle, if you have thousands or tens of thousands of acres, bison have to be better for a prairie restoration than cattle, because they co-evolved with the prairie in North America. From a farming standpoint, cattle have to be better than bison because cattle have been domesticated and are docile. So there's a trade-off, right? Now there are lots of they tend to be smaller, but there are lots of operations of people ranching cattle regeneratively. And in fact, there's a partner of ours, Evergreen Ranching, who actually the call, you guys might have heard my phone go off. That was Cindy calling us. She has acreage in South Dakota, Arizona, and northern Mexico, but in the South Dakota property, she multi-species grazes with bison and cattle. They do well together. They're very closely related animals. They're in the same genus. So that I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah. So and there's been research done. In fact, from Kansa Prairie, they just published recently, and they showed that cattle definitely, if they're grazed appropriately, will increase the diversity of grasslands, but bison do it about twice as good. It's not surprising. It's the difference between using an American chestnut versus a Chinese chestnut. The Chinese chestnut kind of fills that niche, right? But the plants and animals and organisms that live in this area haven't adapted to them specifically. So it's never going to be as good until, a million years of evolution pass through it. So we have to make these sorts of selections and choices based off of safety. For example, handling bison, it's not just that they're hard to fence, it's that they're actually dangerous, right? And we want to use them, and we will use them in the future on larger pieces of property. But part of the selection pressure that we have to put them through is selecting for animals that are manageable in these systems. The other thing to remember about bison is if you put them in a confined area, they will destroy the habitat just like a cow will. Like they will overgraze. They're not panacea just because they're native. It's the management practice that's the problem. So we need to be able to move them from paddock to paddock on a daily basis. It's totally possible. It's just easier with cattle, and cattle are everywhere, and cattle are cheaper. And that sort of thing.
There was, before we get to the 77 acres, there was an anecdote, I don't know where it came from, you told me about the guy had bison and cattle. There was a blizzard, and the bison know what to do in that circumstance. He lost most of the cattle, but some of the cattle followed
Right.
Are you telling me that?
I think so. I remember reading a story about this, but that's another point too, is, you know, just bison have answers for a lot of the climatic issues that are here. Cattle have those answers too, right? They came from places that have blizzards too, but we've just bred it out of them over the years. So anyway, it's about management, it's about selection, it's about context, it's about your resource concern and what you're trying to adjust on that particular site. But if I could use bison only and do it safely, sure, I would pick them. I would pick them over cattle every day.
With regard to the 77 acres, I would love to hear more detail about the condition that the land is in now. But as we alluded to before, if you have livestock and they are in, and they're not being rotated, it really doesn't matter how big the paddock is and how much space they have to move. People think of cows as dumb, but they're actually really intelligent, and they're really picky eaters, and they have very strong preferences for what they eat, which means that if you leave them out in a big pasture, they're going to find their favorite plant and they're going to eat every single one until they've extirpated it. And then they're going to go to their second favorite plant and eat every single one until it's gone. And that's the problem with not rotating, because you don't give the landscape, you don't give those plants time to recover and fill those holes. So the result is just the result is a bunch of weeds that cows don't really like to eat, and everything else is gone. There's also issues with soil compaction, but the thing you do to fix it is the same thing you would do to fix any denuded or degraded piece of land. Put down overseed with a highly diverse seed mixture, and then rotationally graze herbivores over it to stimulate growth. Maybe burn once in a while.
Right. Change your management practices. But another thing to remember too is if you just walk away, nature's going to solve the problem for you over time. It might take 1,000 years, but they're, you know, like just stop doing whatever you did to destroy the land. That's going to be a great start. And then make observations and make your next choice from that point. What do I need to do in order to get this where I want it to go? And that leads to one other point. We're all just gardening at this point, right? Like this whole ecosystem has been destroyed and changed so many times over the last 10,000 years. We're in another version of it where it's about to collapse into a desert. But every choice we make now is just a human choice, right? So we're going to step back. We're going to say, how do I want to garden this patch of land? We're choosing to say we want to garden it in a way that allows us to grow food for people and make space for all the native wildlife that we possibly can, and that ensures our future as a species on the planet. So.
Love that. Well, we are an audience predominantly of gardeners, but this is such important conversation that, so let's close off with this prairie restoration question. How does the work that you're doing expand native landscapes? That's our number one mission, and we're doing it one little flower plug at a time in our backyards, and maybe at larger scale for some of our larger landowners here. But that prairie restoration aspect, what do you see as the ultimate biodiversity result of this extremely forward-thinking or archaic thinking food system?
Thinking.
Yeah. So to go back to something we said earlier, we look at that 50 million acres of oak savanna as our goal. And in particular, we want to convert tilled ground back into perennial agriculture systems. And that's the 50 million acres we want, right? We don't want to take good, healthy forests and do that. We don't want to take like well-managed like native prairie pasture and do that. We want to take the stuff that's really been hit hard and turn that back into something that is anthropocentric, that is designed, but still includes this diverse patchwork and this savanna mimicry. So we also showed the New Forest Farm and Mark's planting, and he has the lanes of grass in between the rows of trees. He's got in the lanes like fescue, he's got like and red clover. He's got pasture, like a pasture mix. But from our point of view, that's just an inferior food for the animals. because the grasses aren't adapted to this region. They don't grow as long. They don't produce as much. You have to reseed them because they're not as hardy. So we want to use prairie, not just because we love prairie, which we do, but also because it's a superior tool for ranching.
Right. Yeah. Why would I plant something that's going to die off and needs to be propped up constantly? You know, why don't I pick the thing that's going to have the least problems? And the prairie biome has the ability to interact with the microbes that are extant here. It has the ability to live through the drought and rain conditions and, you know, all the weather and climatic challenges of this region. You know, all of the animals that live here that can produce the ecosystem services are all going to be able to interact with it better. It's just a better choice. It's the same reason why when we're selecting our trees, we're trying to select natives first and then work our way down from what we need, right? So one thing that we realized early on, we've been trying to do this for a few years, right? And early on we were like, we need to build a farm and then find somebody to run it and do, you know, and create this ecosystem of buyers. And we realized really quickly that like, we're just not going to be able to touch that much ground going like that. And so we've kind of shifted focus recently. We're using our bigger projects like our 800-acre ranch at Powell Gardens as flagship farms to draw attention to what we're doing. But then we want to just cover the ground quickly, till ground quickly. And so, you know, different programs have tried to do this in the past. The NRCS has a program called CRP, where it's like, take your farm out of tillage and we'll plant the CRP mix. And CRP is great. It works really well, except that you can't interact with it, you know, anymore. You can't take hay from it. You can't graze it, right? So what we're trying to do is our version of CRP, which has native or, you know, analogs to native trees that produce food for humans planted on contour, and then highly diverse prairie mix in between, and just get that out there and then leave it, you know, and interact with it in a way that makes it stronger and builds soil. And we believe by doing that, we'll do two things. One, we'll immediately reverse the damage that's being done to the soil by tillage and start to build soil again, ensuring a future of farming. And two, we're going to build these farms that future farmers can then move on to and start using in an appropriate way. And I feel like 25 years down the line, people could still come in and just cut down all those chestnuts and pecans and turn them into, you know, bowls and then herbicide the whole thing. But when I walk onto New Forest Farms, I'm like, oh, I'm home. Like, I would never want to destroy this. Like, this is amazing. It's one of the most beautiful places. So we're hoping that by quickly covering the ground with these scenic and sort of life-affirming habitats that will somehow kind of push people in that direction. Wouldn't you rather your farm look like this rather than that? And wouldn't you rather your food come from there? Wouldn't you rather retire onto a place that looks like that and tinker around fixing fences and babysitting all your great grandkids? So that's kind of where we're at. We're moving in that direction, and we don't have all the answers. We're trying to figure out how to do it. Part of that is we need people to buy the meat and you know, support and buy the trees and support us and buy the honey. And part of it is finding ways to get the guys with the big checkbooks to support it and push it in the right direction. So we're working on it. So
That's brilliant. It's brilliant. And you covered both of my bases, which is lunch and learn. And so we're doing that together. So thank you so much, Dan and Jacob. So many more questions, so much more feedback coming in. Remarkable presentation, but we're so grateful for your time, your passion, the work you're doing every day to promote and sustain and feed our communities here, and for your contribution to Deep Roots today. So this has been wonderful. Now I want to wrap things up here, letting our audience know a few more things about what's going on here at Deep Roots. Lunch and Learn occurs every first Thursday of the month. We do, here we go. Native Plants at Noon also occurs the third Thursday of every month, and Native Plants at Noon is coming up on July 20th at noon. And we're going to lean on our partners at the Missouri Department of Conservation here for a case study with one of our partners in Platte County, Missouri. Similar to this concept of conventional ag versus habitat construction and permaculture of sorts, lawns versus habitat in the suburban landscape of Kansas City, and how to either draw a line between these two parallels, finding a middle ground of some sort. But that's going to be coming up July 20th, right here at noon. And then Lunch and Learn August 3rd, I will not be here with you. However, I am thrilled to announce that Sarah Beyer of Oak & IO Design, one of our favorite partners here, is going to be presenting Deep Roots' revealing of the Sweet 16 most likely to succeed list. And we've been talking about this for quite some time now, to get a group of botanists and native plant professionals into one room to come up with a concise list that didn't actually result in physical altercations or being able to continue to work together. We succeeded, and we're going to present to you what our community of professionals feels are the top 16 most likely to succeed native plants for Kansas City region. And that was informed by native plant professionals, producers, landscapers, designers, horticulturists, and so on. So stay tuned August 3rd at noon for Lunch and Learn in my absence, but Sydney Ross is going to be hosting with Sarah Beyer. Volunteer opportunities, we did include that link in the chat. Nature Advisors volunteers are being recruited to conduct on-site visits for landscape consultation. If you're passionate about native landscapes and native plants, you want to help your neighbors, you want to help your Kansas Cityans to improve their landscape, to pursue their journey. Join me as a nature advisor, and we'll get you out and about into the community, sharing the native plant love. If you want to get your hands dirty, work and learn sessions with Sydney at the Discovery Center, Demonstration Garden, and moving into the future, working in a number of gardens around that incredible landscape that is, to me, one of the most beautiful learning environments and inspirational environments that any native plant enthusiast could ever be a part of. So go to deeproots.org/get involved, volunteer, and support us while improving and encouraging yourselves and your fellow native plant enthusiasts. Lastly, check out all our events and webinars on the website at deeproots.org/events. Webinars are archived all the way back for 2020. And while you're there, if you consider making a donation, we'd be grateful. We appreciate you joining us, and we will see you in a few weeks for Native Plants at noon. But always remember that what you plant matters.